Elvis Oladiel sat frozen in the back of his luxury SUV, staring at the impossible through the rain-streaked tinted glass. A necklace bearing the Oladiel crest, a rare lost star diamond he'd fastened around his fiancée's neck 8 years ago, was now swaying in the humid Lagos air. A 7-year-old girl, Amara, smiles through the window, her tattered clothes contrasting with the shimmering heirloom on her neck. The girl was a beggar, her small hand pressed against the glass. But Elvis wasn't looking at her outstretched palm. He was looking at the jewelry that should have been at the bottom of a ravine, buried with the woman he loved. His heart, cold for nearly a decade, hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. One earth-shattering realization crashed through him like thunder: if the necklace survived, then maybe Doris did too. If you're just tuning into this channel, please subscribe, give this video a thumbs up, and don't forget to share with your friends and family, and tell us where you're watching from in the comments section. The morning air in the Ikoyi penthouse was thick with the scent of expensive lilies, a smell that Elvis Oladiel had come to associate with death rather than celebration. Today marked 8 years since the day he was supposed to stand at the altar with Doris Ihenyan. Instead of a wedding ring, he had been handed a police report and a scrap of charred fabric. He stood by the window, his reflection a stark contrast to the vibrant Lagos skyline. He was a man who owned the city but lived in a tomb. The memories of that night still clawed at him: the frantic phone call, the news of the brake failure, and the horrifying image of the car engulfed in flames at the bottom of the ravine. "Elvis, you're brooding again. It isn't healthy for the soul," a sharp, melodic voice cut through his grief. Chinyu stepped into the room, her heels clicking against the marble floor with predatory precision. She was wearing a dress that was just a shade too bright for a day of mourning. For 8 years, Doris's sister had positioned herself as his primary comforter, slowly weaving herself into the fabric of his life under the guise of shared sorrow. She walked up behind him, her hands resting on his shoulders. "Doris wouldn't want you to spend another year in the dark, Elvis. We've all suffered, but life is for the living." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a persuasive silk. "Even Onus asks why we don't live together like a real family. Don't you think it's time we gave him, and ourselves, some stability? A permanent commitment?" Elvis felt a surge of nausea. She was asking for a proposal on the very anniversary of her sister's death. He remembered the closed-casket funeral, how Chinyu's mother had wailed that Doris was too disfigured to be seen, rushing the burial before Elvis could hire his own investigators. He had been too broken to fight then. But as he looked at Chinyu's expectant smile, a cold realization settled in his chest. The only thing she truly mourned was the time it was taking to claim his last name. He pulled away just as his driver signaled the car was ready, unaware that in less than an hour, a single piece of jewelry would shatter the lies they had fed him for a decade. The heavy door of the Maybach creaked open, and the humid, salt-thick air of Lagos rushed in, but Elvis barely felt it. His focus was entirely on the girl, Amara. Up close, her tattered yellow dress was stained with the soot of the city, yet she stood with a regal posture that defied the chaos of the idling traffic around them. "Where did you get that necklace, little one?" Elvis asked, his voice thick with a decade of unshed tears.
"Where did you get that necklace, little one?"
Amara didn't
It
flinch.
belongs to my mother.
She tilted her head, her dark eyes sparkling with a precocious intelligence that felt eerily familiar. "It belongs to my mother," she replied, her English startlingly polished, devoid of the pigeon typical of the street vendors. "She says it is a light for the dark days. Are you going to buy an orange, big man? Or are you just a fan of the jewelry?" Elvis felt a jolt of electricity. "Your mother, she gave this to you?" "She lets me wear it for luck," Amara said, her smile widening. "She cannot see how it shines, you see. Her eyes are broken from the fire, but she says she doesn't need them. She sees with her heart instead." The word fire felt like a physical blow to Elvis's chest. The accident 8 years ago had ended in a blaze so fierce the authorities said no one could have survived. Ignoring his driver's protests and the honking horns of impatient commuters, Elvis stepped out of the car. He trailed behind the girl as she weaved through the labyrinth of cars toward the edge of the lagoon. They reached the fringes of Makoko, where the shanties rose from the black water on stilts of wood and hope. Amara moved with the grace of a princess, navigating the narrow planks until she stopped before a small stall laden with dusty oranges and shriveled greens. "Mama!" the girl called out, her voice ringing with pride. "I brought a visitor. A man from the big cars who asks too many questions." A woman sat behind the fruit, her face partially obscured by a faded headscarf. She turned her head toward Elvis's direction, her milky, sightless eyes searching the air. Elvis stopped breathing. Even through the scars and the years of poverty, the silhouette of her jawline and the curve of her lips were unmistakable. It was the ghost he had spent 8 years trying to bury. It was Doris. Elvis stormed into the ancestral Aladil estate, the air in the foyer still smelling of sandalwood and history. He found his grandmother sitting in her high-backed velvet chair, her eyes sharp despite the decades they had seen. Without a word, he pulled his phone from his pocket and thrust the screen toward her. On it was a grainy, zoomed-in photo of the little girl from the traffic jam. Grandma reached for her spectacles, her hand steady as she took the device. As her eyes settled on the object around the child's neck, the breath hitched in her throat. The lost star pendant was unmistakable. It wasn't just the way the sunlight caught the central diamond. It was the specific, intricate filigree of the Aladil crest, hand-carved by a master jeweler who had died shortly after its completion. "Elvis," she whispered, her voice cracking with an emotion he hadn't heard in years. "Where did you see this?" "In traffic. A beggar girl, Grandma. She was wearing it like it was a common trinket." The old woman stood up, her regal posture returning. She walked to a heavy mahogany safe in the corner of the room, keyed in a code, and pulled out a velvet-lined ledger, the family's private inventory of heirlooms. She turned to a page dated 60 years ago. "The Lost Star," she read aloud. "Commissioned for your grandfather. 1 of 1. There are no replicas, Elvis. I personally oversaw the vault after the accident, and when they told us Doris's jewelry was lost in the fire and the impact, I believed them. But this..." She tapped the screen, her finger trembling slightly. "This is the original. It carries the microscopic engraving of our family motto on the clasp. A thief wouldn't know it was there, and a jeweler couldn't forge it." She looked up at her grandson, her gaze piercing. "If that child has this necklace, she didn't find it in a gutter. This was handed to her. This necklace didn't die in a car fire, and neither did the woman who was wearing it." The smell of brackish water and overripe citrus hung heavy over the Makoko market, a world away from the sterile marble halls of the Aladil Empire. Elvis stepped out of his vehicle, his tailored suit an alien skin amidst the bustling poverty of the stilt city. His heart hammered against his ribs, guided by the directions Amara had given him during their brief, life-altering encounter in traffic. He navigated the narrow, muddy paths until he saw it, a small, weathered stall overflowing with bright oranges and shriveled grapes. Sitting behind the wooden crate was a woman whose presence seemed to pull the oxygen from his lungs. It was Doris. But it was a Doris carved out of tragedy. Her once radiant skin was etched with silver lines of old scars, and her eyes, the eyes that used to dance when he walked into a room, were clouded over with a milky veil of blindness. She sat with a quiet, heartbreaking dignity, her hands moving with practiced grace as she sorted the fruit by touch alone. Elvis felt the world tilt. The urge to scream her name, to fall at her feet and beg for forgiveness for the 8 years he had let her rot in this slum, nearly overcame his senses. He took a stumbling step forward, his shadow falling across her face. Doris tilted her head, her sightless eyes turning toward him. "Good day, Saw," she said, her voice a raspy echo of the melody he had played on repeat in his memory. "Would you like some oranges? They are very sweet today." He couldn't speak. A single tear escaped, tracking a hot path through the dust on his face. He watched her hands, scarred but steady, reach for a bag. She didn't recognize him. To her, he was just another wealthy stranger, a ghost in the dark of her world. Seeing her like this, broken yet surviving, was a pain sharper than the news of her death. He swallowed the sob rising in his throat, knowing that to reveal himself now, without a plan or protection, would only put her back in the crosshairs of the monsters who had put her here. He placed a stack of high-denomination notes on the crate, took a single orange without a word, and retreated into the shadows of the market, his soul finally on fire with a purpose he hadn't felt in 8 years. Grandma stepped out of her vintage sedan, her lace booba rustling like dry leaves against the humid air of the Makoko outskirts. She didn't look like a woman who belonged near the open gutters and the smell of drying fish, yet she moved with the grace of a queen visiting her subjects. Her target was a small rickety wooden stall where the scent of overripe oranges fought against the stagnant air. There sat Doris, her eyes clouded with cataracts, her hands moving with a practiced rhythmic grace as she polished a heap of citrus. "These are the finest oranges I've seen in all of Lagos," Grandma said, her voice dripping with a calculated, motherly warmth. Doris startled, her head tilting to catch the sound. "Thank you, Ma. They are sweet, like the morning sun. Would you like a taste?" Grandma didn't look at the fruit. She looked at the woman's face, the high cheekbones and the gentle jawline that had once been plastered across every society wedding invitation in Nigeria. Her heart ached for the injustice of it all, but she kept her composure. She wasn't just here to buy fruit, she was here to stage a rescue. "I am looking for someone with hands as careful as yours," Grandma continued, leaning closer so the scent of her expensive oud filled Doris's senses. "I manage a large estate in Ikoyi. My grandson has a garden full of exotic lilies and roses that are dying for want of a gentle touch. My current staff are too rough, too hurried. I need someone who understands the soul of a plant." Doris's hands faltered. "Ma, I am blind. I cannot see the colors of your roses." "You don't need eyes to feel the thirst of a leaf or the strength of a stem," Grandma countered softly, reaching out to touch Doris's hand. "I offer a room for you and your daughter, 3 meals a day, and a salary that will ensure Amara never has to tap on a car window again. Will you come? Help me bring life back to a dead garden." Doris felt the weight of the offer, the chance to pull Amara out of the dirt. She didn't know she was agreeing to step back into the life that had been stolen from her. She simply nodded, a single tear escaping her clouded eyes. "We will come, Ma." The transition from the damp, cramped corridors of Makoko to the sprawling staff quarters of the Aladil estate felt like stepping into a dream Doris could only feel through her fingertips. As she traced the smooth, cool marble of the walls, Amara led her by the hand, her small eyes wide with wonder at the sheer scale of the world they now inhabited. To Doris, the air smelled of lavender and expensive floor wax, a sharp contrast to the salty rot of the lagoon. To Amara, it was a palace where she no longer had to dodge the spray of passing cars. Late that evening, after her mother had fallen into a deep, peaceful sleep on a bed that didn't creak, Amara's curiosity got the better of her. She crept out of the quarters and followed the soft glow of amber lights into the main house. The mansion was silent, save for the distant hum of the air conditioning. She found herself at the threshold of a massive mahogany door, slightly ajar. Inside, the man she knew only as the boss sat on a plush leather sofa, his broad shoulders slumped in a way that made him look small. Elvis didn't see her. His eyes were fixed on a digital photo frame that cycled through images of a woman with a radiant smile, the same woman currently sleeping in the staff quarters, but without the scars, without the darkness in her eyes. A choked sob broke the silence. Amara watched, frozen, as the billionaire she thought was made of stone buried his face in his hands, weeping with a raw, jagged grief that shook his entire frame. On the table beside him lay the lost star necklace, catching the light like a fallen tear. In that moment, the fragments of her mother's whispered stories, the tales of a man whose laugh sounded like music and who had promised her the stars, snapped into place. This wasn't just a benefactor. This was the crying man from her mother's broken memories. Amara realized then that the necklace hadn't just been a piece of jewelry, it was a tether. She wasn't just a beggar to him, and her mother wasn't just a fruit seller. They were the pieces of his soul he had been mourning for 8 long years. The sterile scent of the private clinic was a sharp contrast to the earthy aroma of the orange stalls in Makoko, but for Elvis, the air felt thick with a decade of held breath. He stood in the corner of the recovery room, his hands shoved deep into his pockets to hide their trembling. Beside him, Grandma gripped her prayer beads, her eyes fixed on the woman sitting upright in the bed. Doris looked fragile, her head swathed in layers of white gauze, but there was a new stillness about her, a quiet dignity that even blindness hadn't been able to steal. The specialist, a world-renowned surgeon Elvis, had flown in from London, leaned forward with surgical scissors. "It will be blurry at first, Doris," he murmured softly. "Take your time." As the first few layers of bandages fell away, the room seemed to shrink. Elvis felt the ghost of the man he used to be standing right next to him, the man who had bought a wedding ring 8 years ago that still sat in a safe. With the final turn of the cloth, Doris's eyes were revealed. They were no longer clouded by the milky veil of trauma, but clear, dark, and searching. She blinked rapidly, her breath hitching as light flooded her retinas for the first time in nearly a decade. Her gaze drifted aimlessly until it landed on the man in the corner. Elvis took a step forward, the light hitting his face. The silence was deafening until Doris's pupils suddenly dilated. A sharp gasp escaped her lips, and she clutched at her temples as if physically struck. The Mama Ruby persona, the fruit seller who lived in shadows, shattered. Behind those eyes, the floodgates of memory burst open. The screech of tires, the cold laughter of her sister Chinyu, the feeling of the lost star necklace being ripped from her throat, and finally, the face of the man who was her entire world. "Elvis," she whispered, her voice cracking like dry parchment. It wasn't the voice of a beggar. It was the voice of the woman he had buried in his heart. Elvis collapsed to his knees by the bed, catching her hand as she reached out to touch his face. The darkness had finally retreated. The truth was now as bright as the morning sun. The office was thick with the scent of old paper and the cold realization of a decade-long lie. Elvis's private investigator, a man who dealt in the ugly truths billionaires usually ignored, slid a leather-bound folder across the mahogany desk. Inside were the charred remains of a life, Doris's dental records that didn't match the body in the grave, and a life insurance payout of 50 million naira, cashed by her adoptive mother just weeks after the accident. "They didn't just lose her, Elvis," the investigator whispered. "They sold her. They staged the crash, took the money, and left her for dead in the slums, betting her memory would never return." While Elvis felt the foundations of his world shift, a different kind of storm was brewing in the kitchen of the Aladil estate. Chinyu, draped in expensive silk she hadn't earned, stood paralyzed in the doorway. She watched the woman she had spent 8 years trying to replace, the blind beggar Elvis had brought home, laughing as she arranged a bouquet of white lilies. Doris's eyes were still bandaged from the surgery, but her voice was unmistakable. It was a melody from the past, a ghost claiming its territory. Panic, sharp and acidic, rose in Chinyu's throat. If those bandages came off and Doris's sight returned, the insurance fraud, the kidnapping, and Chinyu's own place in this mansion would vanish. Driven by a desperate, animalistic need to survive, Chinyu waited for the house to grow quiet. Creeping into the conservatory where Doris sat alone, Chinyu reached for a heavy glass vase. Her plan was simple and cruel, a final accident to ensure the dead stayed buried. But as she raised the glass, the shadow of her betrayal was cast long across the floor. Doris tilted her head, her voice calm despite the darkness behind her bandages. "I know that scent, Chinyu. It's the same perfume you wore the night you pushed me into the car." The vase trembled in Chinyu's hands as the predator realized she had finally become the prey. The heavy mahogany doors of the Lagos High Court swung open, not to the sound of a gavel, but to the rhythmic clink of metal against metal. Chinyu, her designer silk dress now wrinkled and pathetic, shrieked as the handcuffs bit into her wrists. Beside her, Doris's adoptive mother hung her head, the mask of the grieving maternal figure finally shattered by the weight of insurance fraud and kidnapping charges. As the police led them toward the waiting van, the sun broke through the Lagos clouds, casting a golden light over the man standing on the courthouse steps. Elvis Aladil didn't watch them go. His eyes were fixed on the woman standing beside him, her bandages finally gone, her gaze clear and bright for the first time in nearly a decade. Doris looked like a vision from a dream he had stopped daring to have. Between them, Amara held both their hands, her businesswoman exterior replaced by the pure, unadulterated joy of a child who finally knew her father's name. Weeks later, the air at the Aladil estate was thick with the scent of lilies, Doris's favorite. This wasn't the somber, rain-slicked anniversary Elvis had spent years mourning. This was the second I do. Grandma sat in the front row, wiping her eyes with a lace handkerchief as the priest stood before the flower-draped altar. There were no closed caskets or mangled lies today, only the truth. "I, Elvis, take you, Doris, again and forever," he whispered, his voice thick with the emotion of a man who had walked through the valley of the shadow of death to find his heart. Doris squeezed his hand, her thumb brushing the lost star pendant that now hung exactly where it belonged. "I never stopped looking for you in my dreams, Elvis," she replied. As they exchanged rings, Amara stepped forward, placing her small hands over theirs. The family that had been torn apart by greed and traffic-choked streets was finally whole. Under the watchful eyes of their ancestors and the cheers of a city that loved a miracle, the billionaire and the girl from the traffic joined their lives, proving that even after 8 years of darkness, the light always finds its way home.